Next topic we had tonight is this question of traditional Catholics worshiping at a Latin Mass in a Novus Ordo church. What is the problem with this, Father? I mean, on the surface, it seems very good. I mean, here you have a beautiful, maybe even seemingly traditional, perfectly traditional Latin Mass, maybe even in a beautiful old traditional old Catholic church. What's the problem there? What is wrong with this?
Well, it is actually, in a sense, a fiction, and it's compromise. It is a compromise with something that we cannot legitimately compromise. There are a lot of aspects to that, Tom, and be patient, because I'm going to try to cover a number of aspects of this. Essentially, what it comes down to is the question of how many different faiths and how many different religions can there be legitimately in one church? And that becomes a more intense question when you ask, in the one true church established by Jesus Christ, how many different religions can there be? It even becomes more intense when the question becomes honest and straightforward and complete. How many mutually opposed faiths and mutually opposed contradictory religions can you have in the one true church of Jesus Christ? This is essentially the question that has to be addressed when you look at this whole question. Some people actually think that in order to practice the traditional Catholic faith, they have to stay within the confines of the modern and modernist church with the Novus Ordo. They think they have to stay within the archdiocese, whose official religion is modernism. It's the new order. They think they have to stay within the confines of that because they say, well, that's the church. And I can't really leave the church, can I, in order to practice the traditional Catholic faith? That wouldn't be right. So I have to find a way to practice the traditional Catholic faith within the confines and under the approval of the modern dioceses, the modern church, which says that my practice of the traditional Catholic faith is basically an anomaly. It's kind of an outlier. It's an extraordinary thing. And what is the ordinary faith and the ordinary religion of the modern church under Francis is modernism and the Novus Ordo. The Novus Ordo, with all of its practices of the new Mass, the new sacraments, and so on, this is the practice of modernism. And modernism is condemned by St. Pius X as the synthesis of all heresies. And that's the faith. This is the faith. This is definitely the faith of Francis. I mean, when he says that God wills all religions, with all their differences and contradictions, God wills all these religions. And all of these religions lead to God. He's giving you the essential belief of modernism. That's like the core of modernist belief. And it is the core of what we know as the complexus or synthesis of all the heresies, are rolled together into one, are there in that idea. Because you look at all the different religions and all the heresies are there. They're all counted there. Modernism just puts them all together in one system of unbelief, actually. A denial of the very Catholic concept of faith. It's ironic that some people are saying, well, in order to practice the traditional Catholic faith, I have to go to the modern diocese and, with their new Mass, the new sacraments. They may even say, I reject those. I won't go to those things. But as long as they offer me a TLM, a Latin Mass, even a Latin Mass, like the Novus Ordo Latin Mass, some would settle for that. Francis wants them to settle for that. He wants to do away with the 1962 liturgy. And he's actually been offering in its place the Novus Ordo in Latin. But there are quite a few people who would say, no, I don't want the Novus Ordo in Latin. I want the traditional Mass in Latin. But this is what Francis is offering. The fact that he's offering that is very indicative of how he sees the traditional Latin Mass as the enemy. And he's already the enemy of his synodal church. It doesn't fit in his synodal church at all. And he's actually already said that the traditional Latin Mass does not actually correspond to the religion that he himself represents. and his synodal religion. It doesn't correspond to that. He's already told them that. But people still insist, well, in order to be in the church, I've got to find a way to practice traditional Catholicism within the confines of the Novus Ordo and with the approval of the local New Order bishop appointed by Francis and approved by Francis. I've got to do this. But you notice the consequences of this. There are very practical consequences as well as theoretical consequences, which are even worse. Practical consequences. When you go into the diocese, in a diocesan church under the control of the diocese, to try to practice your traditional Catholic faith by just kind of, in a sense, going in when they're having a Latin Mass of some species and then leaving afterwards, you're basically turning a blind eye to everything else that's going on, not only in the diocese, but in that church. If they're saying the new Mass in that church, then you are actually part of the sacrilege. Inevitably. I mean, you're just part of a sacrilege. Even if you walk in with blinders on and walk out with blinders in, and 45 minutes to an hour later, you're part of a sacrilege. Why so? Well, if they're saying the new Mass, for example, locally here, we have Old St. Mary's. And there would be traditional Catholics who go down there because they say, oh, it's in the diocese. I can stay in the good graces of the bishop and Francis, and I can still be in, the comfort of knowing that I'm in the church, okay? And still have my traditional Latin Mass. Okay, but you're part of a sacrilege. Why? They have the New Order liturgy in the same church. They have the English Mass every day there. They have the German Masses there. Even they call it the Latin Mass. They don't even designate in their bulletin it's the traditional Latin Mass. It's the Latin Mass. It could be the Novus Ordo Latin Mass, for all I know. I don't know. I haven't been there. I haven't watched it. But they're not designating it the traditional Latin Mass. So somebody who goes to that, even just going to the traditional Latin Mass, there, if it is, I mean, it has to face the reality. Okay, what am I doing here? First of all, I'm receiving a host, okay? They're putting it on my tongue. I'm going up and kneeling down, and they're putting this on my tongue. Where does it come from? Where was it consecrated? Was it consecrated at the previous Novus Ordo Mass? Okay? And from the very same ciborium, the priest now is reaching into the tabernacle, getting the ciborium, and now the hosts that were just perhaps moments before or hours before being put in people's hands, now I'm kneeling down and the priest is putting them in my tongue. And I say, well, I'm okay with that, but the fact is, and they should know, from the fact that when they receive communion at the Novus Ordo, if it was consecrated at the new Mass, right, who knows what's going on there, but at the traditional Mass, they use the gold-covered plate. Sometimes the cloth, too. But they use a gold-colored plate, and it's covered with gold because it is there to make contact with the Blessed Sacrament when particles of the host fall. Everyone knows that's what it's for. All priests who've been priests know that particles of the host do fall. And this is meant to catch all of those particles and to save them so they could be consumed with the honor and reverence due to the Blessed Sacrament and not be trampled on underfoot by the people who are coming to receive communion. But in the Novus Ordo, that is never done. That is not a precaution. They just hand the hosts out. So if the Novus Ordo is celebrated there, they're handing the hosts out to perhaps hundreds of people. And then it comes time for the people who want to come to the Latin Mass, because they would never go to the new Mass, and the true Mass is reverent, and they're coming up, and what they're doing, essentially, effectively, really, is stomping over the particles of the host that fell at the Novus Ordo, the previous Novus Ordo. So they're going up, basically, to receive Holy Communion, honoring our Lord, we can have an act of love for Him. And the fact is, in the Novus Ordo, there is sacrilege, and particles of the host fall, and they're disregarded. This is reality. No amount of intentional blindness can actually make this go away. The fact that they're going there, and the host there might be receiving there, might have been ordained, or consecrated, I should say, at the Novus Ordo. But then you have the problem that perhaps the priest at the Latin Mass is validly ordained. Perhaps he is validly ordained, having been validly ordained by a valid bishop who was validly consecrated by a bishop who was validly consecrated himself. Somewhere along the line, if there was a Novus Ordo consecration or ordination in the line, again, it poses the doubt of what is really being done there. But even if you assume, if you can assume that the priest saying the Latin Mass there is validly ordained, and he actually validly consecrate the hosts, he takes that ciborium, he puts it into the tabernacle, and it will be used at the next Novus Ordo Mass. And then the hosts that the people are be giving at the Novus Ordo in their hand were consecrated at the traditional Latin Mass. And with the host, the particles of the host are falling everywhere. You cannot mix the traditional Catholic religion with the Novus Ordo religion without sacrilege. Because the traditional Catholic gives you the valid sacraments and truly the holy, and the Novus Ordo dishonors, disrespects them, is very cavalier and careless with them, at the least, at the very least. And you're going to have sacrilege. And for those who go to the Novus Ordo for the traditional Mass and whatever sacraments they can receive there, there's going to necessarily be sacrilege. But there are other things too. I mean, you go to the Novus Ordo for the traditional Mass, if you can find it there, and the marriage annulments, you have to turn a blind eye to all the marriage annulments. And the remarriages that, they're just standard operating procedure for the Novus Ordo. This is standard operating procedure in the Novus Ordo, that they nullify tens of thousands of marriages every single year for the most spurious reasons that the Church would never have approved in the course of her history. And then, you have this issue that you're turning a blind eye to the Novus Ordo destruction of the very idea of matrimony in terms of their annulments and remarriages and so many things. The list goes on for a long, long time. But this is the practical problem with going there, that you encounter sacrilegious things that are happening, and you have to face them for what they are. But there's something even more fundamental, and this is basically the thing that really gets back to the question that I asked at the beginning. If you talk to a lot of the people who go to the diocese for a traditional Latin Mass, you would find that they will protest that they realize that the Novus Ordo is actually a different religion. And they are against modernism. I would say, if you ask them, you'd find that most of them agree that modernism has infected the modern church. Francis is the head modernist right now. And yes, he is preaching heresy. And I think they'll agree with that, most of them, if they know anything, they really pay attention. I think they would agree that the Novus Ordo religion is not something that they would accept. They actually reject it. That they will say, well, I won't go to the new Mass. I want the traditional Mass and the traditional sacraments. That's what I'm going to go to exclusively. Okay? And if you ask them why, some of them at least, if not most of them, would tell you, well, the Novus Ordo is a different religion. If you ask them if the new Mass and the new sacraments are Catholicism, if they're Catholic Mass and Catholic sacraments, many of them would say, no, they are not the Catholic Mass and they're not the Catholic sacraments. And that's why I will not go to them. That's why I go to the traditional Latin Mass. And that's why I insist on receiving only the traditional sacraments. And then what they're saying essentially is this, okay, I'm going to a church, which I'm saying is the Catholic Church, even though its official religion and its official faith is not Catholicism. But it is the Catholic Church, and that's why I have to go to it, in order to practice the real Catholic faith and go to the real Catholic Mass. Inevitably, it poses the question, well, how is it possible, from what you're saying, how is it possible to avoid facing the question, at least, well, how many different opposite religions can you have in the one true church? And how many different faiths can you have in the one true church? If you're saying it's the one true church and it is imbued with modernism and professes modernism as its ordinary faith, standard faith, and practices modernism in its Novus Ordo, in its Mass, its sacraments, etc., then how can you possibly think that that can be the same one true church established by Jesus Christ when you say that is the traditional Mass and the traditional sacraments that actually corresponds to that one true faith. And modernism and the Novus Ordo do not correspond to it. That's a very, very serious question that they are necessarily raising. It is inevitable, it is unavoidable that they are posing that very question. And often when you pose it to them, they will not answer it. They refuse to answer the question because they know I cannot say that, yes, the one true church contains the true, has and is offering to me the one true faith and the true sacraments, but at the same time professing modernism and its Novus Ordo religion. And it's all part of the one true Church of Christ, as though there are two different opposite faiths and two different opposite religions in the same church that Christ established. They realize you can't say that, right? And so they simply often don't answer it, because they don't want to answer it, not for you, but for themselves. They don't want to answer it. I've even had some people say, well, you're trying to trick me. I'm not trying to trick you. I'm just asking a very honest question. How many different religions, how many different faiths can you have in the same religion? Well, Tom, here's the problem, okay? By doing what they're doing and going to the Novus Ordo diocese to find the traditional Latin Mass that the Novus Ordo is offering, they're actually conceding the first principle of modernism. In fact, in action, they are actually professing the very first principle of modernism. Because, as Francis says, God wills all religions. He wills all these different faiths. He wills, and all these religions lead to God. And the first principle of modernism, the ecumenical idea, is that you can have multiple faiths in the same religion. You can have multiple religions in the same church. This is a bedrock principle of modernism. In one and the same Church of Christ, you can have multiple religions. And you can have multiple faiths, and it's perfectly okay. Because they've redefined faith as a personal experience. And you can have multiple different personal experiences of God. Everybody has his own personal experience of God, right? So everybody's got, basically, according to the modernist idea, everybody's got his own faith and developing. So the basic principle of modernism, because they've redefined faith, is that you can have multiple faiths, even contradictory faiths. That God can will all these different faiths and all these different religions, even though they're contradictory. And when a person says, I can practice the traditional Catholic religion and believe the traditional Catholic faith within the Novus Ordo, which is modernism and which is a new order of religion, even a synodal church that Francis is building, I can practice my traditional faith within that church. They are already admitting the first principle of modernism. And they're nothing but conservative modernists. Really. That's all they are. And it's going to do some very serious damage to their faith. But I say that you can't mix the Novus Ordo and the traditional Catholic without sacrilege. And I would say you really can't practice the traditional faith within the Novus Ordo, in a sense, without blasphemy. Not just sacrilege, but without blasphemy. Sacrilege is something in practice. Blasphemy is something in belief and faith. Why? Because when Francis says that God wills all religions, all the contradictions, all of their teachings about God, who God is, and these are blasphemous things. To say that God wills these things explains Francis's concept of God. And that's not the God that we as Catholics recognize. It's not the God whom we as Catholics believe in. It's not the God whom the Catholic Church has always held up to us as the one true God. If Francis believes that his God really wants all of these contradictory religions, this is the modernist God who they say is too great to really be adequately represented by any one religion. And so he needs a multiplicity of religions, like so many facets, to display all of his different qualities and characteristics, even if those religions contradict each other. What does that do then? What does that make of God, who is the way, the truth, and the life? What does that make of the God who is the one true God, who can neither deceive nor be deceived, who is the truth itself? It destroys the very concept of God, whom we know as the truth. And it replaces it with a God who is a God of contradictions, a God of, well, surprises, constant surprises, right? That's the blasphemous notion of God that Francis has. And once you start making concessions to this idea, that within the same religion, even the religion established by Jesus Christ himself, you can have a multiplicity of different faiths, you're already conceding to that idea of Francis. That yes, we can have different beliefs, different doctrines, different, it doesn't matter whether you're really Catholic or Lutheran or Presbyterian or Jewish or Mayan or Zoroastrian. God wills all these, and they all lead to God. As I say, once you try to begin practicing the traditional faith within the Novus Ordo and Francis's synodal church, you're actually not only playing with hellfire, but I mean, you're going to be committing sacrilege, and you're going to be actually conceding blasphemy.